We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America. My name's Alice Grundy, and we're coming to you today on a day of great jubilation for some, of extraordinary shock for others, and for many, a day that they're really terrified. I'm speaking with Dr. Emma Shortis. You've been quite recently to Kamala Harris's concession rally. What did she have to say?
Hi, Alice. Yeah, I have. I was there this afternoon, US time. I went over to Howard University and Harris gave a short speech that was remarkably steady considering, what's happened. One that focused on, in her words, love and gratitude, and then on encouraging her supporters, particularly her young supporters, not to fall into despair.
To the young people who are watching, it is okay to feel sad and disappointed, but please know it's going to be okay. On the campaign, I would often say, when we fight, we win. But here's the thing. Sometimes the fight takes a while. That doesn't mean we won't win. The important thing is don't ever give up. Don't ever stop trying to make the world a better place. You have power. And don't you ever listen when anyone tells you something is impossible because it has never been done before.
In this campaign, she said a lot, when we fight, we win, but that sometimes, the fight is a long one, and that now is a time to roll up your sleeves and continue the hard work. She has this line that hard work is joyful work. And so she was really, I think, seeking to reassure her supporters, and particularly the very young crowd, because it was at Howard University. There were a lot of students there and a lot of young women there. So she was, I think, simultaneously trying to reassure them, but also, get them to commit to not falling into despair and cynicism. And as far as that effort goes, I think she probably did the best job that she could. So it was quite a remarkable speech in a very emotional environment.
Mm. And in America, if you're serving jail time, I believe you're not able to vote. And conventional wisdom might hold that if you're a convicted felon, perhaps you can't run for the highest office in the land. How is it that we've ended up in this scenario where a man who has not only been charged with many crimes but convicted is the president-elect of the country?
I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that question, Alice. It is extraordinary when you put it that way, to say that Donald Trump is a convicted felon and he's been elected president. Many people who might be familiar with American politics know that it is, despite sometimes seeming to the contrary, it is kind of very, I suppose, hierarchical and has a real focus on kind of manners and niceties and standards of behavior. And Trump, like with many things, has just kind of thrown all that out the window. And apparently, his appeal to the American people, his ability to tell a story about the American economy in particular, his ability to appeal to white grievance, and his ability just generally, I suppose, to exploit the long historical divisions of American politics far outweighs, the fact that he is a convicted felon, which is really just one of the many extraordinary things about his political rise and then re-rise, I guess.
Mm. And this wasn't the close election that lots of people predicted, whether it was polling or whether it was pundits. How do you think the Republicans mobilized so many voters?
Yeah, look, I think it's going to take us a while to pick all of that apart. I've said a few times in the last few days that there will be so much certainty in analysis in the aftermath, so much finger pointing, so much, things said with great clarity about whose fault this is and or how Trump did it. But I think, clearly his campaign tactic of appealing specifically to men, to mobilizing that core base of men has been successful. It looks also like his appeal amongst Hispanic voters, amongst Latino voters, has been quite successful. They went for him quite hard, and white women as well look like they voted for him in similar patterns to what they did in 2016. And all of that, I think, is a little bit of a surprise in light of the polls, which, as you said, were very close. They were all kind of within the margin of error, and that's not how it's played out. In some of those battleground states, Trump's won by closer to 3% rather than less than 1%, which was what a lot of the polls were predicting. So it looks like, on the face of it, that his campaign's been very successful, but it also looks like the electorate has changed quite a bit in that, Trump's picked up a lot of votes in places like New York and California, which are historically, lean very heavily Democratic. So I don't think this can be read as anything other than a repudiation of the Democratic Party broadly and its failure, its unwillingness or inability to address its own role in the structural failures of the American economy. It just hasn't been able to tell an effective story about, why Bill Clinton in the 1990s signed America up to free trade agreements that dramatically changed the economic landscape of the United States and left a lot of people behind. They just didn't have an answer to those kind of fundamental questions that people clearly have about the past and the future of the United States. And you mix that up with structural racism, structural sexism, and a candidate like Donald Trump, who is better at almost anyone, as I said, than exploiting them. And you've quite obviously got a very effective campaign.
Mm. Since the election results have come in, both Harris and Trump have talked about uniting the country. But as I said, there are plenty of people who are really afraid. What do you think the chances are for a more united America after this election?
I think they're pretty slim, Alice. Donald Trump said in his speech at Mar-a-Lago last night, US time, that now is the time to unite, which is a favourite of his. He returns to that one fairly regularly, and he'll, especially when he thinks he needs to sound presidential or he's had pressure on him from his campaign to sound presidential. And that usually lasts for approximately 8 minutes before he goes back to, before he kind of returns to type. I think uniting the United States was always, possibly, I guess, an impossible task for someone like Kamala Harris, but under a Trump presidency is extremely unlikely because his policies, the policies and the ideologies of the people behind him in particular are incredibly divisive. If you think about one of Trump's signature policy promises, which is the biggest mass deportations in American history, that is going to be incredibly divisive. It's going to tear apart families. And when, draconian immigration policies have been implemented at the state level, it's meant things like people who are just not white or look like they might not be white are being stopped to have their papers checked. That is an incredibly divisive suite of policies that will make people rightly very afraid and very angry. So you have that level of division. Reproductive rights is going to continue to be a hugely divisive issue, I think, as much as Trump has said that he wouldn't legislate a national abortion ban. The people behind him are pretty keen on that. And the Republicans have flipped the Senate, so they have control of the Senate, and it's looking increasingly like they will take the House as well, which means they have Congress, so that means they can legislate on their own. And they also, of course, have the Supreme Court of the United States. They've had that. That's why the Roe versus Wade was overturned in the first place. But because Trump and the Republicans have the Senate, that also means that a Trump administration will be able to replace retiring Supreme Court justices, and there are a couple of quite old ones. So all of that suggests that division will continue. And of course, Trump thrives on that. He thrives on that kind of division. He's certainly not going to be the one to heal those kind of festering wounds of American history that we've talked about before. He's got no interest in that. So I think American politics is in for a period of quite serious division that will really bleed into everything it does domestically and internationally.
So in an America where the Republicans, as you say, control the Senate and potentially the House, and where there have been these increased votes for Trump in states, as you said, like California and New York, what kinds of soul searching do you think is in front of the Democrats from here?
That is such an interesting question, Alice, because of course there's already a lot of blame going around within the Democratic Party and outside it around whose fault this is. So of course there's been a lot of talk about Joe Biden, for example, and the fact that he left it so late to step aside and kind of. I saw one take that said, he threw Kamala Harris off a glass cliff, which is that kind of way of describing, women being put into untenable positions of leadership and being asked to take the fall for men. And I think there's probably something in that. There is also, a lot of very self-interested blame coming from centrist Democrats and even kind of never Trump Republicans suggesting that, what Democrats should have done was been spending more time in Pennsylvania appealing to Republican voters, shy Republican voters shy Democratic voters or swing voters, appealing to those white women perhaps who went for Trump. So there's a lot of that kind of personalised blame shifting or finger pointing going on. And there is also, I think, rightly I'm not sure if condemnation is the right word, but coming from the left of the party and the progressive base, there is a quite reasonable pointing to the Democratic Party or the Harris campaign and the Biden administration's failure to listen to progressive voters and a progressive base, particularly in critical battleground states like Michigan, for example, which is where Joe Biden's kind of immediate troubles really started when 100,000 voters in the Democratic primaries put themselves down as uncommitted rather than vote for Joe Biden to win the candidacy because of his administration's support for Israel and their despair and outrage at what was happening there and the United States' role in it. Those voters in Michigan had been telegraphing that message to the Democratic Party for months in the lead up to the election, and the party, for whatever reason, was unable or unwilling to listen to that. And the margin in Michigan, with the caveat that I haven't checked it for a little while, was sitting at around 150,000 votes. So there's potentially at least an obvious correlation there. And when you look at the fact that Rashida Tlaib, who's the only Palestinian American representative in Congress, was re-elected with a significant majority in Michigan in the same state, that suggests that the party was out of touch in the presidential campaign, was out of touch with the base. And I think there's potentially a lot in that. And I think that's connected to what's being pointed out by a lot of people as a structural problem for the Democratic Party, which goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Its inability to kind of address its own complicity in the economic stagnation of the United States and the deep economic insecurity of so many Americans. To have an effective answer to the question of free trade agreements and what they did to American manufacturing, or to have an effective answer to Americans' insecurity that could counter Donald Trump's effective storytelling around, the decimation of the Rust Belt that appealed to so many people. Which is not to say, I think it's important to be clear that I don't think that's a failure of storytelling on the behalf of the Democratic Party. I think it's a failure of policy and of substance, to actually address those structural economic inequalities and the fact that wealth is so concentrated at the top that someone like Elon Musk can have so much power compared to the vast majority of Americans. The Democrats just don't have an answer to that. And some of them are kind of up to their necks, really, in that kind of neoliberal economic policy. Whether the party as a whole is actually able to face that, to really kind of do that deep reflection on its own role in the rise of Donald Trump is another question entirely. And recent history at least would suggest that they're not very good at that.
Mm. So let's turn to Australia, a country whose Prime Minister was among the first to congratulate President-elect Trump when only Fox News had called it and other media outlets hadn't yet. Trump has vowed to implement a massive global tariff regime that will increase the price of goods and, in all likelihood, exacerbate cost of living issues here. And there are also some fears that his second term could cripple the Paris Climate Agreement, which he already withdrew from once. How should the Australian government be preparing for a second Trump presidency, which seems committed to making these decisions that run counter to Australia's core interests?
It certainly is committed to making those decisions and implementing those policies that go directly against our interests. The decimation of any US climate action, inadequate as it is, being one of them. Look, I think, partly we could be preparing for a Trump administration by at least attempting to not be so afraid, that we don't need to be the first cab off the rank in congratulating Donald Trump for his victory. And it is a victory. I think it's important to say this is a comprehensive democratic victory for Donald Trump, and the Australian government does have to work with his administration. We work with governments we disagree with all the time. That's part of being a grown-up country and operating in the world. But we, at the same time, don't have to be so deeply afraid of a Trump administration abandoning us. We don't have to be kind of first to congratulate him and ingratiate ourselves with him, because he's unpredictable and he only acts in his own self-interests anyway. It's amazing that our government at least doesn't seem to have learned the lesson that, it doesn't matter how loyal you are to Trump. He's only interested in himself, and entrusting your security to somebody like that is a pretty risky bet. So, I think just having that self-awareness about our own fear and where it comes from would be a really important starting point, but also recognizing that, we do have some agency. We don't have to rely on Donald Trump, liking Anthony Albanese or having a particular friendship with him in order to have a workable relationship. The relationship is deeper and stronger than that. And so I think focusing on that could be a place to start. But, hand-wringing in some of the Australian media about Kevin Rudd, for example, is just exhausting because, Kevin Rudd is many things, and one of them is like a pretty decent diplomat. And it's extraordinary that there's so much worry about Kevin Rudd's relationship with Donald Trump because of the fact that Kevin Rudd said that Donald Trump was a threat to democracy. All this worry comes from the fact that Kevin Rudd condemned the insurrection of January 6th and said that it was anti-democratic. That's a good thing. That's a thing that, the Australian government should be proud to have its ambassador say. So I find all of that quite baffling. And I guess just to continue on that thread, the approach seems to be that the Australian government needs to kind of manage Donald Trump, needs to ingratiate itself with Donald Trump and manage him so that we can offset some of the worst successes of his tariff policies, for example, rather than kind of putting them in broader context and thinking about, what those tariff policies are going to mean for broader economic stability in Australia and in our region, and what some of Trump's climate policies or his China policies might mean for our partners in the Pacific. I think the Australian government's going to have to be prepared to really stand up in the Pacific and be a reliable and supportive partner there when Trump inevitably completely abandons the Pacific to climate change, which is what he will do. We know that that's what he's going to do. And so I think the Australian government has to be prepared to stand up there, because if we don't, if the Australian government doesn't do that, what choices does that leave the Pacific that's facing an existential threat from climate change and, worse than no help from the world's most powerful country? Where does that leave them? So I think the Australian government being cognizant of that and preparing to step up in those places, and to be clear about stepping up as well and not being afraid of, upsetting Donald Trump in doing so, would be a pretty good place to start. The early indications are not good that might happen, but that's not inevitable. I think a Trump presidency will be shocking to many Australians, and I think there will be quite a bit of pressure put on our relationship with the United States as Trump's active threat to, American democracy becomes clear, as his climate policies become clear, as his economic policies become clear. You mentioned tariffs, but what's Elon Musk kind of gutting of $2 trillion worth of the US budget going to do, not only to the US economy, but to the economy of the world? I think preparing ourselves for that kind of upheaval, insulating ourselves against it rather than attempting to ingratiate ourselves with it, would be a novel approach.
And one of the concerns that people have had about this election was a potential Harris win and then potentially Trump or other people not accepting that result. But actually, we've seen an incredibly smooth process for the most part, and that these institutions of democracy, while many people don't agree with the result, they have progressed in a fairly standard manner. Do you think in some way this is a kind of a hopeful way of looking at democracy in the States, or do you think that the deteriorations that potentially may happen under the next presidency will outweigh that?
I mean, I think we'll have to wait and see, but it was really striking that Kamala Harris kind of opened her concession speech tonight with an affirmation of her commitment to the peaceful transfer of power and to, the Constitution of the United States and democratic principles more generally. That was very pointed. And I think a lot of the fears about political instability were rightly based on Donald Trump's threat to that peaceful transition, his election conspiracies, his insistence that he wouldn't accept an election loss. And so some of that fear has gone away because Trump won, so comprehensively and democratically. That's not to say, though, that his threat to the institutions of American democracy is not still real. It's still very real. He will gut the independent public service of the United States. He will eliminate whatever checks and balances still exist between the executive and the Department of Justice, and potentially will continue, as generally speaking, Republican legislatures have done at the state level for a long time, to undermine voting rights, to continue to disenfranchise Americans. So all of that suggests to me that Trump, will continue to be a threat to American democratic institutions, not just Trump, but the people around him, and how they can withstand that when, the Republicans have, as we said before, Congress, the executive, the presidency, and the Supreme Court is pretty concerning because, of course, the Supreme Court has also ruled that Donald Trump, the new president-elect, effectively has immunity for his actions in office. What is that going to mean for the integrity of American democratic institutions? It's an open question. But in terms of the immediate political instability, I think Americans are breathing a bit of a sigh of relief because there were a lot of real very legitimate anxieties around that. I've seen a few Democratic operatives on TV kind of say, I'm breathing a sigh of relief, at least it's over. At least we don't have to worry about that bit anymore.
Yeah, right. And we were briefly talking about Albanese's response to President-elect Trump, but we've also seen President Zelensky of Ukraine and Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel come out and congratulate the president-elect on his victory. Notably, not Russian President Putin so far. What could this mean for the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East?
Well, so Trump and his surrogates have been really clear that they want to effectively withdraw American support for Ukrainian resistance. They've been objecting to this for a long time, particularly the Freedom Caucus in the US Congress. So the kind of far-right caucus has objected to any support for Ukraine, and Trump's been clear that will be gone. And there have been some very serious recriminations in Europe over the last couple of days about how, Europe has known this was coming. They've seen it coming for so long, and they've said they were preparing and they just weren't. So this will have pretty immediate and serious effects for that conflict, but also for Europe more broadly, as it's kind of thrown into crisis by its inability to respond, I think, to this crisis. So that's the immediate consequences for Europe. In the Middle East, I think, Benjamin Netanyahu has made it pretty clear that he was hoping and waiting for a Trump victory, because Trump has effectively said that, Israel can do it at once. He's anti-war in the sense that he's said basically to get it over with, which is a really horrifying prospect, I think. And I think maybe what's being underestimated, because, Trump sucks all the air out of the room, takes all the focus, is the movement behind Trump's ideological support for Israel. So I saw J.D. Vance speak at a foreign policy conference last time I was here, and he spoke about Israel, and he spoke about what he described as moral foreign policy, and that morality being grounded in effectively white Christian evangelical nationalism. So the way he phrased it was that, he sees Israel as the place where his savior was born and died, and therefore his support for Israel is unconditional. And so that kind of evangelism, I think, will be increasingly evident in American foreign policy. There will likely be significant tensions and infighting, I think, in foreign policy, especially as, there will be tensions between that kind of J.D. Vance school and potentially Mike Pompeo, the former director of the CIA, Trump's CIA director, who kind of loves the deep state. He doesn't want to dismantle it. He wants to control it. So there will be tensions between that loose Trump coalition, especially in foreign policy, and it remains to be seen, how that will play out and who'll win those arguments. But, the right and the far right is ascendant. This is a generational victory that they quite clearly regard as an opportunity to implement the full suite of their agenda. So we will see, I think, some pretty radical changes in the United States' role in the world.
Mm. Well, Emma, this has been a really extraordinary few days. Thank you so much, as ever, for your calm rationality on what are otherwise very heated subjects. This episode was recorded the evening of Wednesday, 6 November US time. Who knows what might have happened since then? If you're enjoying After America, please help us spread the word by telling your friends about the show. You can find us on social media. We're at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and Instagram, and you can reach out to us with feedback and episode ideas via our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Alice Grundy. Thanks for listening.